It was late October, and the cold had settled deep into the bones of Hillsbury, a small, forgotten town nestled in the middle of nowhere. The days were shorter now, the sun barely making an appearance before dipping behind heavy, gray clouds. By evening, the temperature plummeted, leaving the streets empty and quiet. There was a bitter bite to the air, the kind that made your breath cloud in front of you and chilled you to the core, no matter how many layers you wore. Ethan sat alone in his small, creaky house on the edge of town. His wife had passed away the year before, leaving him with a silence that echoed through the rooms. He used to love autumn, the crisp air, the smell of wood smoke, and the crunch of leaves underfoot, but now it was just a reminder of how empty everything had become. Tonight, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the old window panes and sending leaves skittering across the porch. Ethan stared out of the living room window, watching the last remnants of daylight fade into the thickening dusk. The trees, bare and skeletal, swayed in the wind like ominous figures reaching toward the house. He sipped his coffee, the warmth doing little to stave off the creeping chill that had settled inside him. He glanced at the old clock on the mantel, 7:30 p.m. The hours seemed to drag now, the long nights making him restless. The house, once filled with warmth and life, now felt oppressive, as if it was pressing in on him from all sides. Suddenly, a noise broke the stillness, a soft, deliberate knock at the front door. Ethan froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. Nobody came out this way, especially not on a cold, blustery evening like this. He set his coffee cup down, the ceramic clinking against the wood of the table, and stood up. For a moment, he wondered if he should even answer. After all, it could just be the wind playing tricks on him, knocking a loose branch against the door. But then, the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Ethan's heart began to pound in his chest, an irrational fear rising in him. He had lived in this house for decades, never feeling unsafe. Yet tonight, something felt wrong. Very wrong. He approached the door slowly, each step heavy as if the air had thickened, holding him back. He reached for the doorknob, hesitated, then finally pulled the door open just a crack. The cold air hit him like a slap, but the porch was empty. No one stood there, not even a trace of footprints in the scattered leaves. He opened the door wider, leaning out to peer into the growing darkness. The wind howled, sending a gust of frigid air swirling through the hallway behind him. Nothing. With a sigh, Ethan stepped back and shut the door, feeling a little foolish. It was probably just some kids playing pranks, trying to scare the old man at the edge of town. He locked the door and made his way back to the living room, but the uneasy feeling lingered. As he sat back down, he noticed something strange. The clock on the mantel had stopped. The second hand was frozen in place, stuck at 7:30. Ethan frowned, leaning closer to inspect it. He had wound it just this morning, and it had been working fine all day. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the back of the house. Ethan shot up from his seat, his heart racing. It sounded like it came from the kitchen, like something had fallen or been knocked over. He stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, listening. The house groaned under the weight of the wind, but the sound had been too deliberate, too unnatural. Gathering his courage, he grabbed the heavy flashlight he kept by the couch and cautiously made his way toward the kitchen. The hallway felt longer than usual, the shadows clinging to the walls, shifting with the flicker of the dim light overhead. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he reached the kitchen doorway. He swung the flashlight beam across the room. Everything looked normal at first, until his eyes landed on the back door. It was wide open, the wind howling through it, whipping the curtain around like a flag in a storm. Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew he had locked that door. He was sure of it. He stepped forward, flashlight trembling in his hand. As he reached for the door to close it, something caught his eye, a figure, standing just at the edge of the trees in his backyard. It was dark, but the outline was unmistakable, like a person standing perfectly still, watching him. A chill colder than the night air shot through him. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the wind or the cold. It just stood there, barely visible through the swaying branches, like it was waiting. Ethan's hands shook as he slammed the door shut and bolted it, his mind racing. Was it a person? An animal? His rational mind struggled to explain it, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. He rushed back to the living room and grabbed his phone, intending to call the police, but as he unlocked it, the screen flickered and died, the battery suddenly drained. Before he could react, the knocking started again, this time from the back door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Ethan felt a wave of dread wash over him. He knew, without looking, that the figure was closer now. That it was no longer standing at the edge of the trees. It was right outside. His breath quickened, his chest tightening with fear. He backed away from the kitchen, moving toward the front door. He had to get out. He had to. The front door thudded violently, as if something was pounding on it from the outside. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks, trapped between the 2 doors, the wind outside roaring louder, the knocks more forceful, more aggressive. And then, all at once, the knocking stopped. The house fell silent, the only sound his own panicked breathing. For a moment, he thought maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had been there was gone. But then, from behind him, he heard the soft creak of a floorboard inside the house. Every October, the town of Greystone came alive with the annual Autumn Fair. Nestled in the valley, surrounded by thick forests of oaks and maples, the town was picturesque, especially in autumn. The trees blazed with reds, oranges, and golds, their leaves fluttering down onto the cobbled streets as families bundled in scarves and jackets made their way to the fairgrounds. It was a beloved tradition, full of caramel apples, hayrides, and games under the glow of strings of amber lights. But this year, there was something different. An undercurrent of unease whispered through the cool autumn air, like a chill that didn't belong. Some townspeople said it was just the strange weather, with fog rolling in earlier and thicker than ever before. Others muttered about the old grounds, the overgrown patch of woods on the far edge of town, long abandoned and sealed off. It had been that way for decades, after an incident that no one seemed to talk about anymore. But the fair had grown too large for its usual location, and this year, the town council decided to open the old grounds for the event. It's nothing but superstition, they said, brushing off concerns. The place just needs some sprucing up. And so, the fairgrounds were moved to the old grounds. The first night of the fair was like any other. Families arrived in droves. Children laughed as they ran between the booths, and the smell of kettle corn and hot cider filled the air. But as the evening went on and the crowd thinned, a creeping fog began to roll in, thicker than before. By midnight, only a handful of stragglers remained. Among them was Clara, a local teenager who worked one of the food stands, closing up for the night. She loved the autumn fair, but this year, something felt off. The fog, the strange location, the uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. As she locked the booth and grabbed her bag, she noticed the lights around the grounds flickering, first faintly, then more violently. Clara stopped, squinting through the thickening fog. The sound of laughter had died down, and the fairgrounds were unnervingly silent. It was as if the entire world had fallen still. Her breath clouded in front of her, and the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She quickened her pace, walking toward the exit, when she heard it. A faint melody, almost like a music box, drifting through the air. It was coming from deeper within the old grounds. Clara paused, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't noticed any rides or attractions left open in that part of the grounds. It was cordoned off, still tangled with overgrown weeds and old machinery that hadn't been touched in decades. Yet, the music called to her, hauntingly sweet, pulling her forward. She hesitated but couldn't resist. Something in that music. It was almost hypnotic, like a lullaby she half remembered from childhood. She stepped off the path, pushing through the damp leaves as the fog swirled thicker around her. The lights from the fair faded behind her, swallowed by the dense mist, and soon, she found herself standing before a rusted old carousel. It was enormous, much larger than the one that had been used in the fair earlier. The horses were frozen mid-gallop, their once bright paint faded and peeling, their eyes chipped away, leaving hollow, staring sockets. The carousel creaked as it slowly turned, though there was no wind. And that melody, it was coming from the carousel itself, the haunting music box tune playing on loop. Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This carousel hadn't been part of the fair. She was sure of it. It looked ancient, forgotten. The fog pressed in around her, suffocating and damp, and the chill in the air seemed to seep into her bones. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers grazing the metal pole of one of the horses, slick with moisture. As she touched it, the music stopped, plunging the night into eerie silence. And then, the carousel began to move faster. The horses' frozen expressions seemed to shift in the corner of her eye, their mouths curling into twisted, unnatural smiles. The creaking of the old machine grew louder, grinding and groaning, as if awakening after a long slumber. Clara stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. She turned to run, but the fog had thickened, disorienting her. The path back to the fair was gone, swallowed by the mist, and as she scrambled through the underbrush, she heard footsteps behind her. Soft at first, but growing louder, closer. Panicked, Clara glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing. Just the fog, dense and impenetrable. Yet the footsteps continued, echoing her own. She ran faster, her pulse thundering in her ears, her legs burning with effort. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, the soft, damp leaves making her slip and stumble. Then, just ahead, she saw a figure. A child. A little boy, no more than 7, standing motionless in the fog. He was wearing an old-fashioned outfit, short pants, a buttoned shirt, and suspenders, the kind kids wore in the early 1900s. His face was pale, almost too pale, his eyes wide and blank. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Are you lost?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. The boy didn't respond. He just stared at her, his head tilting slowly to the side. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked deeper into the woods. Clara's heart pounded. Something was wrong, very wrong. But her legs moved on their own, following the boy through the trees, the fog parting slightly in his wake. She wasn't sure why she followed him. Maybe it was the fear, maybe it was the isolation, but something about the boy felt both terrifying and familiar. They walked for what felt like hours, the fog never thinning, the fair now a distant memory. Eventually, they arrived at a small clearing, where the boy stopped in front of an ancient, crumbling stone well. He turned to face her, his eyes hollow and empty, before pointing down into the well's dark, yawning mouth. A soft whisper rose from the depths, faint, almost indiscernible. Clara strained to hear, but the sound quickly grew louder, more urgent, like a chorus of voices, all calling her name. Terrified, Clara stumbled backward, but the ground seemed to pull her closer to the well. The whispers grew louder, the air around her thick with a cold, suffocating pressure. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, she saw them, faces, twisted and grotesque, emerging from the darkness of the well. The voices were theirs, calling her, beckoning her to join them. The boy smiled, a slow, eerie smile that stretched too wide across his pale face. Clara turned to run, but it was too late. The fog closed in around her, and the whispers consumed her. Jack loved the quiet of the forest in autumn. The colors of the leaves, the crisp air, the smell of damp earth. It was the perfect escape from his busy life. One Saturday afternoon, with the sun low in the sky, he decided to take a walk through the woods just outside of town. The trees were ablaze with oranges and reds, their branches swaying gently in the cool breeze. He wandered deeper, feeling the peaceful stillness settle around him. The crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound as he ventured down an unfamiliar path, but that didn't bother him. He liked exploring new trails, even if he didn't always know where they led. After about 30 minutes of walking, Jack realized something odd. He had passed the same large oak tree twice. It had a peculiar scar on its bark, shaped like a jagged lightning bolt, something you wouldn't easily miss. "That's weird," he muttered, turning around to head in the opposite direction. But after 10 more minutes of walking, the oak tree reappeared, standing right where it should be. The same jagged scar stared back at him. Confused, Jack stopped and looked around. The woods were getting darker, the air cooler, and the once pleasant rustling of the leaves now seemed to carry an unsettling whisper. He checked his phone, no signal. He tried retracing his steps, convinced that he must be just gotten turned around. But no matter which way he went, he kept coming back to that same oak tree. The scar seemed almost deeper now, like it was growing as time passed. Panic began to creep in. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and the light was fading fast. Jack's heart raced as he picked up his pace, desperately trying to find a way out. But every direction led him back to the same spot. The oak tree was always there, waiting. And with each loop, the forest grew eerily quieter. And then, he felt it. Something was watching him. At first, it was just a feeling, a prickling on the back of his neck, a heaviness in the air. But as Jack moved, the sensation grew stronger. He started hearing faint footsteps behind him, just barely audible over the crunch of leaves. He would stop, turn around, and see nothing but the endless sea of trees. Yet, with each circle he made around the forest, whatever it was got closer. Jack began running. He didn't care where he was going, he just needed to escape. But no matter how fast he ran, or how many turns he took, he always ended up back at the same scarred oak. His breaths came out in ragged gasps, the cold air burning his lungs. The footsteps behind him were no longer faint. They were heavy, deliberate, getting closer with each passing second. He didn't dare look back. The fear in his gut twisted tighter and tighter until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. And then, as he rounded the oak tree once again, he saw it. Just at the edge of his vision, something tall and dark moved between the trees. It was indistinct, like a shadow without form, but it was there, looming, waiting. Jack's stomach dropped as the thing crept closer with each loop. His legs were burning, his mind frantic, but he kept moving, hoping against hope that he could find a way out before it reached him. But the forest had trapped him. Every path led back to that cursed oak, and with each step, the shadow grew closer, more defined. Finally, Jack couldn't run anymore. He stumbled and collapsed at the base of the oak tree, panting and terrified. The air around him had gone deathly still, the whispers in the leaves now a low, ominous hum. Slowly, he looked up, and there it was. The thing stood over him, towering, its form almost human but too tall, too twisted. Its face, if it even had one, was hidden in the shadows that seemed to shift and ride. Jack was paralyzed, his mind screaming for him to move, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The shadowy figure reached down, its presence overwhelming. Cold, too cold. The darkness around it seemed to stretch, expanding, swallowing the trees, the ground, the sky itself. And then, as Jack's vision tunneled, the thing bent down, close, until it was right in front of him. The last thing he felt was the cold, suffocating darkness enveloping him, pulling him into the void. And the forest returned to silence.